Zone.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here at the Zoom platform and also on YouTube, those on YouTube. It is a great honor to open this series of talks, Reading in Interfaces, Theories, Methods, and Applications, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Postgraduate Program in English, the PGI, which was founded in 1971. So this virtual event is organized by Mel from UFSC, Núcleo de Estudos em Leitura, under my coordination, and Gempi from PUC, Rio Grande do Sul, Grupo de Estudos em Neurolinguística e Psicolinguística, coordinated by my colleague Lilian Christine Hubner, with the support of Programa de Pós-Graduação em Inglês, the PGI UFSC. So before I introduce our speaker and moderator for today, I would like to say a few words about this event. Since this talk today celebrates the closing mark of the series that began back in March with monthly talks. So I'm just going to make this brief retrospective. We've had 9 speakers, 9 moderators, all well-known and respected researchers in their areas of expertise, all somehow related to reading and learning. And we've had more than 1,600 hits on YouTube for all the talks. And we deeply thank each one of our speakers, Ladislao Salmeron from University of Valencia in Spain, Sandra Luizio from USP in Brazil, Marcel Just, Carnegie Mellon University, USA, Davi Oliveira from UNEB, Brazil, Charlene Newman from the University of Alabama, USA, Brandon Weeks, the University of Hong Kong, Regine Kolinsky from the University of Brussels in Belgium. So we thank all of our colleagues who were here and the moderators. And of course, we kindly thank Professor Mary Helen Immordino-Yang, our speaker for today, for having accepted our invitation so promptly. We also thank Sidney Van Wolfe for his participation as our moderator. Yes? And a special thanks goes to Harissa from the PGI for helping us with the technology during this whole year, and also Tatiana Kiri-Chandon for helping us with the logistics. So, now I'm going to say a few words about Dr. Mary Helen. Dr. Mary Helen Immordino-Yang is a professor of education, psychology, and neuroscience at the University of Southern California and director of the USC Center for Affective Neuroscience, Development, Learning, and Education, CANDLE. She studies the psychological and neurological development of emotion and self-awareness and connections to social, cognitive, and moral development in educational settings. She uses cross-cultural, interdisciplinary studies of narratives and feelings to uncover experience-dependent neuromechanisms contributing to identity, intrinsic motivation, deep learning, and generative, creative, and abstractive thought. Her work has a special focus on adolescents from low social SDS communities, and she involves youth from these communities as junior scientists in her work. A former urban public junior high school science teacher, she earned her doctorate at Harvard University in 2005 in human development and psychology, and completed her postdoctoral training in social affective neuroscience with Antonio Damasio in 2008. Since then, she has received numerous awards for her research and impact on education and society. Among them, an honor coin from the U.S. Army, a commendation from the County of Los Angeles, a Cosarelli Prize from the proceedings of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences Editorial Board, and Early Career Achievement Awards from the ERA, the AAAS, the APS, the International Mind, Brain, and Education Society, and the Federation of Associations of Behavioral and Brain Sciences Foundation. Immordino-Yang was a 2018-2019 Spencer Foundation Mid-Career Fellow. She served on the U.S. National Academy of Sciences Committee, writing How People Learn, Learners, Contexts, and Cultures, and on the Aspen Institute's National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development. Currently, Immordino-Yang is conducting several funded multi-year neurobiological research studies on adolescent students and their teachers. She is serving on the advisory board of the UNESCO World Education Assessment and as past president of IMBES, among other national and international roles. So with no further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Immordino-Yang so that she can give her talk.
Thank you very much.
Mary Helen.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind invitation and an introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm just going to jump right in to the talk. And I understand that there are both scientists and educators in the group, so I'll try to do something of interest to both. The talk that I'm going to give you today is about the work that we're doing with teenagers, with adolescents from poor backgrounds in Los Angeles area, and looking at the ways in which young people's meaning making, the way that they construct stories of the things they've witnessed, the ways that they engage with, sort of dispositionally engage with learning from the things that they witness in the world, trying to make sense of these things. And as they bring those dispositions for curiosity and for sense making and for ethical deliberations and kind of systems level thinking to their reflections on the things they witness or the things they live, what we've shown is that the propensity to do this transcends IQ. So it's something that is not strongly correlated with IQ, and actually when we control for IQ, it becomes even more robust, the impacts of these kinds of thinking on young people. So I'm just going to kind of take you through and sort of start at the beginning of the brain data for those who aren't familiar. But the big lesson that I think both neuroscientists and educators can take away from this work, I hope, is that the ways young people develop dispositions of mind and heart, the ways that they build meaning out of the things that they learn, the stories they tell themselves of the things that they've experienced, their dispositions for doing that are actually instrumental tools for them to grow themselves over time. We literally show that they change their brain development over time, and that this brain developmental changes, not the kind of brain a kid has, right, comparing each kid to the other, but comparing a young person to themselves 2 years prior, the ways that young people grow themselves over time actually predict their young adult happiness, how much they enjoy their life, their close relationships, how much purpose they have, the sort of integrity of their identity, right? All kinds of things that are arguably the most important outcomes we could imagine for our young people. And so this has really important implications, I think, both for the way that we understand brain development and the young people's active role in growing their own brains, and for the way we design educational settings and opportunities so that they promote young people's abilities and propensities to engage dispositionally in this kind of meaning making. And I think that many of the most, sort of historically, valued ways of organizing education for teenagers are potentially not just not supporting this kind of thinking, but are actually potentially undermining it in too many cases. And this would have really important implications, not only for young adults' ability to think well, but also for their social emotional well-being in a kind of coordinated way, for their ability to be active and thoughtful participants in a democracy. So I'm going to start by just showing this short video. Our lab was featured in a science television program a couple of years ago in the US, which just gives you, for those of you who do not do neuroimaging work or who aren't familiar with this kind of work, gives you a sense of how I do the studies. We bring young people to the lab, we interview them about real stories from around the world of other teenagers, and then we look at when they're thinking of those stories again during MRI scanning and reporting to us in real time how they're feeling. How is it that their dispositions for making sense of the stories in the interview predict the ways in which they activate their brains and bodies as they're engaging again with the stories, and what does those together mean for their long-term growth and development? So just to give you a sort of intuitive sense, let me just make sure I'm sharing the sound. Yes, okay.
Hey, welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm Mary Helen. Nice to meet you.
Since her days as a teacher, University of Southern California neuroscientist Mary Helen Immordino-Yang has been interested in knowing how emotions factor into learning.
I quickly realized that there was very, very little known about the kind of stuff that we really care about in education, like how people become inspired. How do we become interested in things? How do we build curiosity? And how can we support that process?
In trying to identify which parts of the brain are involved in the deepest and most meaningful learning, Immordino-Yang works with teens from troubled neighborhoods.
We're going to be watching stories. We really want to know what you think, so there's no right or wrong answers. These are kids who see a lot of crime, they see a lot of dangerous things, they see a lot of poverty. And we wanted to understand, how do they make meaning of that world around them? This first one is a story about a girl who lives in Swat, Pakistan. And the city was being taken over and basically run by a group called the Taliban. So I want you to watch her when she was 12 years old.
First, she gets them emotionally engaged in a topic by showing them videos about people struggling to overcome adversity.
And I want to become a doctor.
So how does her story make you feel?
This story makes me feel upset how she wants to be a doctor and continue on with her education, but it makes her sad that knowing her journey would be very difficult.
For adolescents, these types of stories can trigger moments of deep reflection.
They come back from those kind of reflective moments with this heightened appreciation of the meaning of the story and what it applies to in their own life and what it means for the nature of the world more broadly.
And it's crazy how it's that powerful.
Whereas we've known that for a long time in education, the neural data are giving us new insights into the mechanics of that process. Over here.
To find out which brain regions are harnessed during reflective emotion, Immordino-Yang monitors the students' brain activity as they re-watch the emotional videos in an fMRI scanner.
Hi, Estella, how you doing in there?
Good.
So we're looking at the movement of the blood flow in her brain as she's watching the stories, and where in her brain is becoming more and less active as she's experiencing these emotions.
She found that the reflective thinking caused by these emotional videos triggers widespread activity throughout the brain.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. And the science I'll explain to you in more depth, but it just gives you a sense of how we do this work. And so what we basically find at the most basic level, which now many neuroscientists have described in different ways with different experimental paradigms, is that the experience of feeling emotions, right, being consciously aware of emotions that you're having, involves brain systems that are also fundamental for feeling and regulating the body and for maintaining consciousness, right, as compared to coma, right, and constructing a sense of self or self-awareness. And because of this, right, meaningful learning, for those of you who are in schools, always involves emotion, because it's the emotion that drives the thinking. It's the thing that makes you think harder and that makes you try to understand in a way that actually forms long-term memories that you then carry forward. And so just looking quickly at the brain to understand a little bit about the brain systems that we're most interested in here before we get back to the teenagers. For those of you who aren't neuroscientists, these data that I'm about to show you are from the first experiment that we did that was published in 2009. So these are from adults. We had adults react to true documentary stories in an interview and then later in the scanner and ask them how they were feeling in the scanner. And what I'm going to show you now is just a very basic analysis, a sort of comparison analysis of the times when individuals said they were feeling deeply emotionally engaged with the story, deeply moved by it, compared to when they said, you know, I'm not that very much moved by this story. I listened and I paid attention, I thought about it, but it's not that important to me, you know. And unbeknownst to the participants, of course, there were control stories mixed in, which were true, interesting stories about people's lives, but without the strong, real implications for deep understanding. And so what we show now is just a contrast between those two conditions. And in orange are the places in the brain where there's more blood flowing relatively when people are claiming that they're engaged deeply emotionally with the story as compared to when they say they're not particularly emotionally engaged with the story. And what we basically showed is that emotional engagement, the process of being moved by something deep and complex that you're thinking about, involves the same brain systems that keep you alive and that manage consciousness. So for those of you who are not neuroscientists, what we basically show is a series of brain regions that come up again and again in studies of emotion, emotional experience, and also studies of morality and self-processing, interestingly. Also studies of pain and pleasure, studies of autonomic arousal and regulatory capacity, right? All of these dimensions of a person's sort of management of self in the world are leveraging a series of brain networks that are interacting in dynamic ways with each other to produce a whole person in context who's able to manage themselves adaptively and socially in the world. But just to give you a sense of some of the brain activities, for those of you who don't know, we consistently get, as do others, very specific kinds of circumscribed activations in the brain stem. So we're up in the middle of the back of the head, like above the roof of the mouth here. You can see like the tongue underneath here and the nose. And up underneath here, we get activations in there, even for the neuroscientists in the room, when we control for psychophysiological reactivity and breath and all that by the simultaneous recording of psychophysiology that we're doing. We still get these robust activities when people say they're experiencing strong emotion as compared to when they're less emotionally moved. And these regions in the midbrain and medulla are involved in very basic ways in sort of translating, if you will, between the cortex, all the stuff up at the top that does the complex calculations that we associate with thinking, and the spinal cord coming out the bottom that goes out to the body and face and comes back in from the body and face. So these are very, very centrally located regions of the central nervous system, which are essential for survival. And when you have damage in these, you get all kinds of profound disturbances of consciousness, like coma, persistent vegetative state, and even in the case of the medulla, rapid death. We can really not even keep you alive on life support when you have extensive damage to the medulla. And this is just meant to show a fundamental thing, which I think is really important to lift up when we're talking about the development of young people, which is that the ways in which we emotionally experience the social world are fundamentally co-opting and activating and repurposing regions of the brain and brainstem, which are also those that are responsible for managing our physiological survival in the most basic sense. We also get activations, as do many other laboratories now, in the anterior insula. These are regions of the brain that are kind of tucked underneath. This is a picture from Grey's Anatomy, the textbook, right? Not the TV show. Eyeball goes in the little fold over on the side, for those of you who don't know, and there's a Sylvian fissure, like a cracked open part where you could look inside and see these big pieces of brain. If you poke around up in here underneath my cursor especially, we have 70 years now of evidence, starting with Wilder Penfield in the 1950s, in neurosurgeries that he did with epilepsy patients, where he would basically put a person to sleep, open up their head, wake them back up, and poke around and stimulate the brain before he resected to try to control intractable epileptic seizures in order to know what they would destroy in the person's brain if they cut something out that was starting seizures. And at the same time, he made arguably the first maps of the alive, awake human brain before we had neuroimaging. And what happens when you poke around up in these regions of the dorsal anterior insula, the person basically gets all kinds of gastromotoric distress. They vomit, they get nauseous, they do other things with their intestines that I won't describe in polite company. And what we then showed is that, and now many other groups as well, that these regions of the brain are actively also activated in all kinds of cognitive and affective states that involve self-awareness and processing of values-driven information or emotionally, affectively laden information at a cognitively conscious level. Things like agency and motivation also instrumentally involve these regions. So these are regions that are literally feeling your guts and viscera that are being repurposed in the service of making sort of emotional meaning out of your experience, constructing a sense of experience. And then finally, we got activations in a network of the brain, which neuroscientists will immediately recognize as the canonical so-called default mode network. There are now thousands of studies showing activations in this network. Ours was among the first that actively showed a functional activation in these regions as compared to a deactivation during a task, an activation during the task, because generally these regions activate when you're resting, when you're daydreaming, when you're trying to remember things in the past, but when you're not really attending to a task-oriented thing. We asked people to reflect actively on the stories and let us know how they feel. And we got active activations in these regions, which we now interpret and have much more work to show and combined with other labs around the world, that these regions are not just for resting, they're actually kind of integrative regions where you construct what I would call transcendent meaning that is not bound by the current physical and social context, but instead is something that transcends and is about, in general, what's true or what's ethical or the historical context or possible future, imagined scenarios, these kinds of things. So this kind of thinking is really, really instrumental for making deep understanding and building meaning around the things that happen to us and around the things we learn in school and around who we want to be. And all of these kind of transcendent notions that cannot be sort of operationalized in terms of things that you could directly look at a person and see. They're instead the story behind why. They're the reasons how. And that kind of thinking, I'm deeply fascinated by understanding how it is that adolescents develop new propensities to do that, characteristic propensities for so-called abstract thinking that have been described for centuries in adolescence, and the affordances of their capacities to engage with this kind of abstract thinking for their own intellectual growth, their social and personal identity-related growth, and what this would mean for how we design educational opportunities and experiences and assessments, given that this network is profoundly deactivated when you're asked to attend to the world, when you're watching things come at you in the middle of playing a soccer game and like making sure the ball is coming your direction and kick it in the goal, right? Those kinds of things are not conducive states to reflecting about the deeper sort of emotional and moral meaning of the relationships you're building while being on the team, right? And you need both kinds of thinking. And to be able to actively move yourself between these in accordance with the demands of the situation in order to be a fully functioning, fully self-actualized human who can move and live in a social world with others effectively and ethically. And so we're deeply trying to understand how it is that young people come to build propensities to engage these networks in coordinated ways that may have affordances for them growing and living over time. So for those who aren't familiar, the default mode network is really active when you're internally reflecting about things, a state that we called constructive internal reflection in a paper I wrote in 2012 with some students. But it's suppressed when your attention is directed outwardly, when the teacher says, 1, 2, 3, all eyes on me, everybody's moving their pencil on the paper, it's time to go, right? Write your math problem, right? Which is really important to be able to do and marshal yourself to do it. But I would argue that we overprivilege those kinds of states in education at the potential detriment of helping kids develop deep, situated self-awareness in intellectual contexts that potentially afford them the opportunity to really feel like they belong and to grow themselves emotionally and cognitively in coordinated ways over time. So one way to say it is that thinking deeply about things is essentially telling complex emotional stories to yourself. And, I think that these findings alone have really important potential implications for young adults and young people's well-being, for their character, right? Because character is not just about what you do, it's about why you do it and who you stand for and why. What does it mean for how we use technology, right? Technology right now is affording me the opportunity to speak to all of you all over Brazil when I'm in faraway Los Angeles. So it's amazing, but it can also interrupt your ability to sort of be in the here and now and interact with those around you constructively. And we need to think about how do we leverage the affordances of technology for young people? How does it change the way we think about what it means to be productive, right? Because productivity doesn't just happen when you move your pencil on the paper, it happens in your mind. And you need potentially certain kinds of situational kinds of dynamics to be able to enable you to be safe to go to places where you make this kind of meaning, but also you can't do it inordinately too much because then you start ruminating, right? So it's like really a balance, and it's about regulation to move and notice appropriately when you should be in which space, which we're very, very interested in. And how does it change the way we think about quote unquote critical thinking, which we often think about critical thinking in education as manipulating pieces of semantic information according to procedural memories, right? But when do we stop and think about, wait, what's the bigger implication? What's the broader historical context in which we're doing this? What is the potential future outcomes of designing this bomb right now, right? Or learning about this physics? We need to be thinking outside of the actual doing it. And then come back to the doing it based on what we decide when we're outside of doing it. And that is really a fundamental capacity for ethical living in a democratic world. So let's go back for a moment to this young woman, Isela, who was nice enough to let us interview her on camera for this television special. And I'm going to just take you for a moment to what Acela said, and we're going to dissect that a little bit. And I've kind of just know that for the purposes of the presentation, I've put together what a couple kids have said to be able to demonstrate the ways in which young people talk. So she says on camera, this story makes me feel upset. She wants to be a doctor, continue on with her education, but it makes her sad, knowing her journey would be very difficult, right? All these things are Acela making sense out of stuff that she learned from the video, right? She's directly interpreting Malala's situation in the video and her emotions, and she's being empathically engaged with that. Very important skill, right? But then she goes on and does something I would say is cognitively very different. She stops and says, it's crazy how it's that powerful. And if you noticed in the video, she kind of turns her eyes away and closes them for a minute and comes back and says, it's crazy, right? How it's that powerful, which gives you the sense that she's about to move outside of Malala into something that is a powerful idea. It's not just about that situation itself is powerful, but that it invokes powerful lessons about how the world works or how the world could work for everyone, including herself and her own friends. So she says, and this part got cut out of the Nova special, she says, I mean, makes me think about my own journey in education, right? Take it back to self-related things and how I want to go to college and hopefully be a scientist someday. And even more, I guess what really hits me is how not everyone's able to get this chance or to go forward with their life and get an education or do what they want to do with their life. I mean, it's not right, right? She starts saying all these things, then she makes it broader. Well, not everybody, and then herself. And then she says, wait a minute, there's a moral lesson here. Not something that was told in the story, something that I have to extract that's true in general. And she says, I guess, right? She stops for a minute. When I think more, yeah, it makes me feel upset that others live like in certain parts of the world where they don't want people to learn. And they're trying to like hold them back. But then, and then she stops and pulls away again. Her story inspires me, right, back to self again, to work harder so that I can prevent those things from happening maybe. Everyone everywhere should have the chance, something very generally true, right? Everyone everywhere. It's not about Malala, it's not about me anymore. It's about everyone everywhere. All human beings should be able to live free and choose their life future. So what you see here is something that is very characteristically adolescence, right? 6-year-olds may say, I really like Malala. I want to be a doctor like her. I want to help her. That's not fair that somebody shot her. That's evil, right? But 16-year-olds can say, wait, it makes me realize that there's something at stake for the entire world and that I too am part of that system and should do things about it. And should appreciate things in a different way because there's something generally that should be true everywhere that we could work toward. That kind of transcendent, abstract construal is something that is really what adolescence is characteristically all about to me. That, if you could say, what is one hallmark of adolescence, it's that. The propensity, the drive even to do that. So we were studying this in young people. And so what we're saying is that there's a concrete kind of direct empathic engagement with Malala herself, right? And how it makes me feel, this kind of empathic resonance that's in yellow. And then this blue stuff is arguably much more complex and abstract. It's not just about Malala, it's about the general world. So how do adolescents' newly developing abilities to think abstractly converge with their well-described propensities? Anybody that's ever been an adolescent or raised an adolescent or both, right? I have 2 of them myself, knows that they have a very strong propensity for emotions about social things. How do those things converge to build the kind of idealism that adolescents so recently in the world have been showcasing for us, right? Emma González, Greta Thunberg, like where does this come from and how could we enable it? So we can look at the level of traits. So what we did was we had 65 young people from immigrant families in Los Angeles from various backgrounds with their parents from all over the world. We did that on purpose to try to look at cultural and other kinds of situational dynamics which I'm not going to talk about here today. But we first looked at their interviews across 2 hours of discussing a series of 40 stories. And we asked the young people how those stories make them feel, just like we did to Acela. And we looked at to what degree did they talk concretely and empathically about every story, and to what degree are they also having abstract, more transcendent meaning making. And what we show is that, first of all, concrete and abstract ways of interpreting the stories were uncorrelated. Kids could do some of one, some of the other, a lot of both, right? And every adolescent in our experiment did at least some of each across the experiment. And these analyses I'm going to show you are now controlling for standardized IQ. We measured each youth's full-scale IQ, and we show that there is a very loose correlation between IQ and these ways of talking, but even controlling for those, and I should say especially controlling for the correlation with IQ, that's where the real work starts to happen neurologically. And also, it's not explained by socioeconomic status, by their parents' education level, by the amount of money in their household, anything like that, or even by their age, although age is marginally positively related to abstract thinking across age 15 to 18, which makes sense. What we found is that the more a young person spoke concretely, empathically in the interview, said, "Oh, poor Malala, that's so hard, and it's going to be so difficult for her to go on. I hope she can do it. I feel terrible for her," right? Which is a very reasonable thing to say. The more they did that, the more we show what neuroscientists will immediately recognize as the canonical executive control network in the brain. This is a network of regions that kind of organize themselves. And of course, these have smaller networks that are component networks and all that, which we won't get into right now. But these networks sort of organize their activity in a coordinated way when a person needs to sort of marshal their attention and focus into the world right now. And so kids who did this more activated this network more across the whole hour of scanning. And the more they talked abstractly, which remember is uncorrelated with concrete, so they could do some of both, right? And did, the more abstractly they talked in the interview, just as you might suspect, the more as they reacted to the stories across an hour of scanning, they activated these blue to green regions, which you'll recognize as canonical regions of the default mode network, right? Regions that are activated to kind of construct internal transcendent understanding that is not things you can directly see and watch and interpret by looking at the world around you. You need to actually make sense of the story to be able to understand at that level. And what we found also is that these traits went along with real world propensities. So kids who had more concrete talk in the interview also reported better relationships with their friends and with their teachers and their families. They had better acceptance of diversity, more willing to have friends from various different ethnic backgrounds, things like that. And the more abstract talk kids used, the more creative or thoughtful they were when we invited them to speak for some time in another interview about, for example, the problems with crime and gangs in their neighborhood, right? Other kinds of real world issues. Their thinking was more creative and thoughtful and realistic about those issues when they were asked if you could come up with any solution and tell the leaders to implement it, what would it be, right? And they also did things like had better scores on a standardized test of creativity, like how many ways can you use a brick, right? It just sort of more flexible thinking was associated with abstract thinking. And again, kids could do both, right? So we can also look at the level of mechanisms. How is it that young people engage in a mechanistic way this kind of abstract transcendent thinking? And so the next analysis that we did, by the way, these analyses just came out in a paper in Social Cognitive Affective Neuroscience, like, I don't know, a month ago, something like that. So I can point you to the paper. But if you can, we controlled now for a young person's own mean emotion level, mean level of activation in these networks, mean level of abstraction, right? So now we're looking at the mechanistic level relative to how much emotion you usually feel when you feel more emotion, relative to how abstractly you usually talk when you talk more abstractly. What is happening in that trial in your brain is what I'm showing you now, right? And what we show is this very complex, interesting, dynamic interrelation between the connectivity of these two different networks in real time. So what we find is that increased activity in the default mode network during a trial, as they're reacting to one story for 20 seconds, especially, right, so there's a positive moderator, especially if the participant reports being strongly emotionally engaged. Strong emotional engagement drives this process, and decreased activity in the executive control network, which I don't, you have to get the regulatory capacity kind of out of the way. All of those together predict abstraction in the interview. But, and this part is, I think, very interesting, brief executive control network activity early in the trial, in the first 2 TRs, as the person is sort of, the movie ends and they're just being asked to think about it. As they kind of rally themselves to think about it, you need early executive control network potentially to kind of get your head on straight that you need to think about something hard here. This is not something you could just daydream about. But then those executive networks, consistent with our data, would suggest that they have to then deactivate, and they profoundly deactivate relative to baseline of the kid's own baseline, right? So they get out of the way while the default mode is making this kind of abstract meaning. That interpretation would be consistent with our data. This is another just sort of picture of this, right? So abstract construals in the interview are predicted in the scanner by default mode activity, by emotional engagement, and by decreases in executive control, except for an increase early. And so what this really kind of means, I think, for education is that emotion in the context of abstract thinking may organize network activity and drive the thinking forward. We think of emotion as interfering with complex thinking, but that is not what our data suggests. And interestingly, there was no evidence of this in concrete thinking. More emotion in the context of concrete thinking just made more activity overall everywhere in the brain, but there was no increased predictive power for anything that we were measuring. It's just kind of a mess, so to speak, right? It's only in the context of these complex, abstract, transcendent, wait, let me figure out what this means, bigger than just Malala for the whole world, that emotion really was driving. And what we also showed just before I end is really quite strikingly, I mean, it's really kind of jaw-dropping how this came out of the data, is that adolescents' propensities to talk abstractly in the interview, above and beyond IQ and family socioeconomic status, predict their brain development 2 years later. So not the state of their brain, but the amount of change from time 1 to time 2 in the connectivity between the default mode network and the executive control network. So in other words, how these two networks are kind of talking to each other at rest in wave 1, and then again 2 years later, the change in how coordinated they are at rest is predicted by this abstract thinking, which in turn, the change in that coordination, the increase in it, is mediating young adult outcomes, how happy they are, how coherent their identity in an Erickson sense they are 5 years later. So this is just a really roughly done, we're just writing these findings up right now, but roughly done sort of model just to show you is that when they talk abstractly in the interview, that's predicted by a coordination between these two brain networks. And over time, as they're getting older, the change in the coordination between those networks is mediating the implications for their identity development as young adults. There's no direct relationship between how abstractly they talk and how coherent their identity, how much they endorse statements like, I really know what I stand for, I have a purpose in my life, I'm working towards things, I know what I think is right and wrong, and I gauge from that place. Or the degree to which they endorse statements like, I don't know, I just kind of go along with what everybody else thinks. I don't have a real sense of what I think. I just do what everybody else thinks is good, right? Which is really associated with anxiety, depression, is not good for you, right? And so what we find is that via the brain network change in connectivity, not the amount, but the change, we actually can mediate this and explain it which in turn, by young adulthood, 20, 21, 22 years old, is explaining how well they're doing in school, if they're in school, how well they're doing in their job, if they're in work, and their life satisfaction, how much they report they like their relationships, themselves, how much they like who they are at school or at work. And it negatively predicts what we call identity diffusion, which is that, like, I don't really know, whatever everybody else says is good is what I kind of do. Right? And just for those of you who are interested, IQ, of course, correlates with this structural change in voxel-based morphometry, right? So the actual thickness of the cortex, the volume of the cortex, the gray matter, from age, wave 1 at age 15, 16 to age 2 years later at 17, 18, right? It correlates in all these yellow areas, which you'll recognize as medial temporal lobe areas associated with semantic memory and things like that. But above and beyond that correlation, abstract talk predicts thickness change, increase or lack of decrease in thickness in all these regions in blue, the dorsal anterior insula, the medial frontal gyrus, the anterior cingulate, right? All these core regions that are involved in affect, emotion, cognition. And this is controlling for IQ, showing DTI, right, diffusion tensor imaging, looking at the major fiber tracts in the brain and how much they increase in fractional anisotropy. So the quality of their connectivity, how much leaky water they have versus really effective communication across big parts of the head from front to back, right? And what we show is that abstract talk above and beyond IQ and socioeconomic status, again, is predicting the development of these major structural bundles of communication on both sides of the brain. So just for those educators in the house, I'll take it back for a moment to what this might look like when we're engaging with young people, for example, in science class. So some years ago, we ran a science camp for young people from Los Angeles. 20 young people participated from across the city. What we did was basically just put up flyers in all the poorest parts of the city, and kids wrote to us to say why they wanted to be in the camp. It was fully paid for by the National Science Foundation of the United States. And what the kids don't know is we had 6 times as many kids who could participate fill out this thing and write to us within 2 days of us putting up the flyers, which is already kind of heartbreaking, saying they wanted to come to a free camp on studying neuroscience for 3 weeks at University of Southern California. But we picked, they don't know this, but we picked the kids who were the poorest, the kids who were living in homeless shelters or on the street, the kids who really, really thought would have no other opportunities to do this. And so we interviewed the kids at the beginning of the camp before they started in private interviews for 15 minutes, just to ask them, who they were and why they'd come. And so we have some responses from them from the interview at the beginning, where we just asked them, what is a scientist to you? What does it mean to be a scientist? Because these are all kids who want to be scientists, right? A scientist is, finish the sentence, okay? And they say, good at science and math, needs to be able to answer all questions and have the periodic table memorized and know everything about anything. Be very efficient. It's all about speed. A person who worked in labs all day, taking information out of rats. A person with glasses that is skinny. They have been studying so hard that they don't have proper health and they are tired or weak looking, right? I always wonder why they want to be scientists, if that's what they think a scientist is. But anyway, a nerd who is antisocial, did not like having much fun, right? Notice cognitively, these are all about appearances and capacities that are in the person that you could directly witness, right? 3 weeks later, after just doing a whole set of experiments and learning how to use equipment and trying to make each other experience emotions and see how emotions change, what they can do, and try, it was a very exploratory, constructivist kind of curriculum. Same kids. A scientist is someone who can walk into a subject blindfolded and explore and eventually become an expert, is constantly working with instruments which may come with no set of instructions, but just persevering and sticking through it until it all works out. Hello, growth mindset, right? Almost completely opposite of what I used to think. Yeah, conceptual change, meta-awareness of cognition, right? Not only do scientists not spend all day in the lab, but they're constantly engaged with other scientists and they collaborate their research, so it benefits them all. They're very engaged, very open, cares about what others think and their ideas. Any person who is curious. Okay, so it's not true that you become a scientist just by being curious. That doesn't make you a scientist. You need to learn a whole lot of stuff. But boy, that's a better starting place than being a nerd with glasses and a white coat, right? Why? Because it's about the disposition of mind that you bring. Anyone could bring that disposition of mind. You don't have to have a certain appearance or set of skills. You have to have an inclination to engage with the world in a particular intentional way. That's what makes a scientist. And I would argue that this is exemplifying that shift from the concrete, empathic, what do you see, that's what you react to, right? To this bigger transcendent meaning, in this case about what a scientist is. So we also, the next question is always among educators, can we promote this kind of meaning making? So we don't have time to talk about it today, but a whole series of studies that we did before and during the pandemic. These are not stock photos. These are the real people in our studies, which is amazing to me, I think, of young people and elderly people from the same environments, the same poor neighborhoods, interacting with each other in these intense 8-week sort of friendship building narrative curriculum where they engage with each other around their own life stories and try to understand who they are. And by doing that, kids naturally start to talk more abstractly and transcendently by the end and start talking about their own life in these more values-driven ways. And what we show is that those values-driven ways of talking about their life actually mediate increases in life purpose, in well-being, and things like that. This is Rodrigo Rivera's dissertation work from my lab. He just recently won the Dissertation of the Year Award from the Association for Moral Education for this work. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Immordino-Yang, for your inspiring talk. It was amazing, made us reflect a lot. It has a lot of implications for education and also for the world that we want to have in the future.
Yes, that's right.
And also for the digital world we live in now, that came up a lot with the pandemic. Yeah. So thank you very much for your talk. And I would like now to introduce our moderator, Professor Sydney Wolfer, who is going to conduct the questions. Okay. So let me introduce you to Sydney. Sydney Werner Wolfer is a PhD student in the postgraduate program in English at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, Brazil. He has been advised by Professor Leda Maria Braga Tomic since 2014, when he started his master's in the same postgraduate program. In his master's thesis, he investigated the role of working memory in the processing of verbal and pictorial information of illustrated text among adolescents learners of English as a foreign language. Sydney is graduated in English, Portuguese, and Spanish, language and literature, and dedicated more than 15 years of the teaching of these languages for children and adolescents in Brazilian public schools. He is also the holder of the Perpetual Chair number 15, a tribute to the poet Mário Quintana at the Brazilian Academy of Letters of Santa Catarina, section of TAIO. Sydney is a current substitute professor in the Letras course, English and Portuguese at Universidade Regional de Blumenau, FURB, and is a member of NEL, Núcleo de Estudos em Leitura from UFSC. In his doctoral dissertation, Sydney reviews a series of studies, models, and theories that give support to the hypothesis that among adolescent learners of English as a foreign language, the practice of reading through singing, when compared to prose reading, results in better vocabulary learning. His moderation of today's talk is associated with one of the main pillars of his doctoral dissertation, which proposes that positive emotions, as induced by the practice of reading through singing in English classes, broadens adolescents' focus of attention and cognition, and thus may result in their better vocabulary learning. The dissertation also speculates that positive emotions may optimize the use of working memory attentional resources. So, Sydney, thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. And please, if you could now conduct the questions.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone in Brazil. Good morning, Professor Immordino-Yang. I would like to say that it's an honor to be here today, and that this is one of the most significant opportunities that I've had during my postgraduate studies. And because of that, thank you again, Professors Leda and Lilian, for having invited me to be here in such an important event. Well, I remember the first time I read the text by Professor Immordino-Yang and Damasio, "We feel, therefore we learn, the relevance of affective and social neuroscience to education." The text was indicated by Professor Leda in one of the courses that she offered at the Federal University of Santa Catarina here in Brazil. And I remember that some days after reading that text, that we had a private conversation, and we decided to change the topic of my doctoral study and started investigating the role of emotions in vocabulary learning in adolescent learners of English as a foreign language. So since the day I read that text, I have been trying to deconstruct and reconstruct the understanding of the way cognition, and more specifically working memory, processes and maintains information during learning, taking into consideration what the learner feels. Or in Immordino-Yang and Damasio's words, understanding that emotions are not just messy toddlers in a china shop, running around, breaking and obscuring delicate cognitive glassware, but instead they are more like the shells underlying the glassware. Without them, cognition has less support. So I'm extremely grateful to Professors Mary Helen and Leda for having challenged me in such a way and for bringing me back to the path that I always intuitively walked through years ago as a public school teacher, but that today I see as this mission or in my studies and in my pedagogical practices. So Professor Mary Helen, I'm going to start with two questions that I've prepared, and then I will proceed with the moderation of the participants' questions. Considering your talk today, everything you've been saying about inference-making processes, abstract construals, transcendent thinking, and how emotions have a huge impact in the context of abstract thinking, and also considering the way that you describe emotions in your publications as the rudder that steers thinking, I would like to ask you something which is extremely relevant to my doctoral dissertation. Can I?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So positive psychology, and more specifically the research conducted by Dr. Barbara Fredrickson from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, has found robust pieces of evidence that positive emotions broaden people's scope of attention, cognition, and action urges. That is, people's willingness to be playful, to interact, to learn, and to read. So her research includes these very controlled lab experiments and also experiments in more natural settings. So based on her research, I'm daring here to hypothesize that adolescents, when induced to positive emotional states such as contentment and joy in English classes, they get better results in terms of vocabulary learning. So how to do that? By teaching vocabulary through songs that contain meaningful messages for them in this life period. Thus, daring a bit more, we've been thinking that if emotions in general can be considered this rudder that steers thinking, it may be that positive emotions, by broadening working memory focus of attention, can be seen as the force that widens the horizon and thus the possible destinations that thinking may navigate towards, since these studies have been shown that people see more and that these people establish more conceptual links among words in texts, for instance. So considering all of this and what you have been seeing in your study so far, yes, how do you see this interpretation of the horizon being broadened by positive emotions, and more specifically about the role of positive emotions in real-time cognitive processing and learning?
Yeah,
question.
that's a really great question. So here's what I'm saying. I'm going to do the classic professor move and kind of say, I think you should test that. And here's what else I think you should be thinking about. So the work that we have traditionally done in both learning and conceptual, right, working memory and all these kinds of things, and emotion in learning settings have almost all been in this very context-dependent, concrete mode of learning and thinking, right? So what's happening in those experiments, I'd have to go back and look to make sure this is true. You would know way better than I do. But you have, as the teacher, a bunch of words that you need your students to remember, and then you're going to find ways to present those to them in ways that they can then assimilate and digest them and build from positive emotion an openness to engaging with those words so that they can store them in semantic memory and recall them later. That's really important. But I also think that in tandem with that, we need to think hard about how it is that young people engage not just in ingesting what you send at them, but how they come to the space disposed to search for and pull into themselves the information that they need to be able to think about things they care about. So it's kind of balancing out the seesaw in education. We usually think about the teacher having the knowledge and the student not, and the teacher has to give the student the knowledge, and then the student needs to be able to ingest it, assimilate it, and recall it. But what our work is also showing is that while some kinds of learning are like that, the kinds of learning that potentially really grow young people's dispositions of mind and their stance toward the process of learning and engaging itself can't be given to you by a teacher who really effectively is teaching you how to remember words. It's about how are you using those words? How are those words enabling you to say, I don't know, engage with conversations with other young people that you otherwise couldn't talk to because you couldn't understand them, or writing, op-eds in the newspaper about things you deeply care about that use those words, right? So it's kind of shifting the model, and I know this is contentious, right? But why not, right? Shifting the model, the predominant model in education, from one in which teachers push things at students, and teachers' main role is to get it so students can take it, right? To one in which teachers set students up to pull things in as they need them. Because when you need it, you certainly will work really hard to get it, and you're almost guaranteed to thoroughly remember it. And so, right, it's kind of solving some of the problem about helping kids remember by changing the role of schooling from recall what I've given you to let me set up a world for you that you need to know this stuff. And your need helps drive you to pull it into yourself. It feels like you needing as compared to me pushing. And that, I think, is an even more powerful way to change conversations in education so that emotions become really instrumentally integrated into the thinking and memory processes. Does that make sense? So I basically said, yeah, I think that's great. And it's super important that we also think about that as only a piece of what schools are meant to do and what teachers are meant to do.
Yeah. While you were giving your explanation, I was reminded a situation in which I asked my college students about the role of teachers in society. And then they said something. After that, I presented a video of this old man sitting in front of a church, a blind one, asking for coins and with this saying, I'm blind, please help me. And then this lady comes and changes the saying. Yes, the blind man recognizes the lady because of her high heels. And then after her changing his saying, people start giving him coins and money. And then the lady comes some days later, and then he again recognizes her by touching her high heels. And then he says, what did you do to my saying? And then she said, I wrote the same, but in different words. And then the saying appears, it's a beautiful day, and I can't see it. So I asked my students about the teaching of the English language, because this is our context here. What does it mean to be a teacher? Yes. And it's not only about teaching the language, but what you do with the language that you learn. So I don't know if I'm in the right path.
There you go, right? Exactly. So what did the people walking by, seeing that sign, learn, right? That changed how they understood the situation and how they then acted, right, to give money, which I love that story. Can I copy that? I'll attribute it to you. I mean, it's like, what did they learn? The teacher was wise enough to change the context so that the people naturally were driven to learn and understand something in a new way, as compared to the teacher told everybody walking up on the street, that man is blind, you should feel sorry for him and give him money, right? Which would be the traditional approach that we take in teaching, right? Let me tell you what you should do, and now I can see if you did it, and that's how you know if you learned. But instead, that teacher set up the world so that people were really likely to learn from their own self and to construct for themselves from the inside what they ought to understand about that situation that they previously had not. I love that example, right? I love that example. And I want you to really think about how that example could inform the kind of dissertation work that you're doing. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. I'm going to make a connection here between a question of mine and a question of Professor Lilian Hübner.
Okay.
Well, my second and last question refers to the role of literary narratives in English as a second language, writing development. And this has to do with these narratives, I guess, that help build adolescents' brains. So studies are suggesting that when learners are initially involved in reading literary narratives and having characters exposing their feelings, they better perform in writing tasks about the topics presented in those texts. Right. The studies, however, do not show that learners simply repeat information found in those texts.
Interesting.
What they show is that learners seem to develop better comprehension of their own emotions and of themselves as human beings, like developing a kind of emotional intelligence, like empathy. Mm-hmm. And the question of Professor Lilian Hübner is the following one. I was wondering whether empathy, contextualized feeling, thinking in a broader way as opposite to thinking in a selfish way. If you, Professor, think that this more contextualized exterior way of seeing the world is more inbuilt by individual differences, or would it be more tailored by exposition in their families and schools? So I guess the question is about empathy and building empathy and how this can help one build these narratives which are used for their own comprehension as individuals in society.
Now that is like the number one important question. And the honest basic answer is, well, we just don't know, right? But there's a whole lot of things that we actually don't, like we really don't understand how people come, how people have certain talents or dispositions. How does this come from? We loosely see things running in families, like, Picasso's Picasso, not Mozart, right? Now, of course, Picasso had paints and Mozart had instruments. If he didn't, then he couldn't have been Mozart, right? But yet there was something very unique about him, right? So I think we need to think about it as a complex, dynamic set of relationships. And this is something, we know that tendencies toward empathy are in part mediated by biological variables that are, that run in families and traits. Psychopathy is something that runs in, which is a kind of marked low, lessening of empathy, which doesn't necessarily make you a bad person. It makes you different, right? Than people who are deeply empathic. Being on either end of that spectrum can be associated with problems. But being somewhere in the middle makes for individual variation. That is what makes the world go around, right? But if you're a hugely empathic emergency room physician, when somebody comes in from a car crash, you're weeping in the corner over the fact that they got in a crash. Like that's not helping anybody. You need to save his life. Like, get it together, right? Turn off the empathy and starting the heart, right? So it's like these things, what really makes for an educated, wise person is your ability to build these different mind states and dispositions for meaning making and for affective engagement with other people in context appropriate ways. Being able to know when is appropriate and when is not, and when you should actually stop your actions and realize, wait a minute, there might be a broader ethical consideration here I hadn't even thought of. I think I'm just buying groceries, but actually buying this particular fish is really bad for the environment or for these fisher people or something like that, right? Noticing that there's a bigger story behind some things but not other things is part of what counts as a dispositionally wise person. And how do you learn that? You learn it by practice. You develop these dispositions. Now, undoubtedly, there are going to be some dispositions that people are sort of more or less inclined toward. That is going to have to be the case. We don't know that. We have not demonstrated that. And undoubtedly also, the way in which young people engage with the adults they deeply care about in their life is going to shape the way they think and feel. And there's abundant examples of that, though not in abstract thinking specifically that I know of. And of course, those things are confounded as scientific hypotheses because the people you live with are generally also those who have the genetic predispositions you have. So, knowing what is nurture and nature, like these things are really completely intertwined with one another. And what I would say is that it's something that we hope we'll understand better into the future. But for now, for education, what really matters, and is very, very important to engage with is the fact that young people, all of them did at least some of this in our studies, right? Maybe we had a very weird sample of 65 people, but, we just went into high schools and said, hey, do you want to be in these science experiments? And, we had a huge range of kids in there. All of them did at least some of it. And in the second set of work that we did with it's called the sages and the seekers, right? These elderly people and teenagers, we showed that the kids increased naturally. Nobody told them, think transcendently, be abstract here. What's the bigger lesson or the moral implication of the story that this elderly person just told you? They didn't say that. They just said, like, ask them, what happened? How did you feel? And then tell about yourself and engage with that. Kids were naturally coming across an 8-week intervention to become more and more inclined to think about the bigger sort of transcendent meaning that they could extract for themselves and for the world in general beyond just what that elderly person experienced and taught them. And we saw patterns in how this happens, right? Like these stories that Rodrigo called redemption narratives, right? Where, where people overcame difficulties or bad circumstances in order to achieve something despite of them, or even because of those circumstances, right? Those kinds of stories came up again and again, but it becomes a skill and a disposition that you develop over time. And one of the things that I'm most interested in studying in the next 10 years, I don't know, but we're actively going at this, is what do these dispositions look like in different kinds of intellectual domains, right? So right now we have started by looking at the social world, which is very fundamental to all humans, right? But what does it look like in physics or math? What does it look like in arts or history or literature? And these are questions that I think are really, really important to try to understand, because maybe what people bring is also a combination of desires and propensities to think abstractly, but in domain-specific ways that accord with the kinds of processing that they're inclined toward, or that they have, right, that they have opportunities to learn about, because you clearly need a lot of knowledge to be able to build these stories. If you've never heard of things like this, how could you even appreciate, right? If you've never heard of a gun, then how could you understand Malala's story, right? So there's factual information, experiences you need, but then there's also something more than that you need to make sense. And so this is exactly, thank you for the question. And it's, have me back in 5 years, maybe I'll have more insight. But this is exactly the question that I think we really need to grapple with. What does it look like to become an ethical physicist? What does it look like to become an artist who changes how people understand a complex issue that's at the core of, racism or socioeconomic inequality or environmental, concerns about the planet. Like, what does science in that context look like? Starting to shape our education system so that we enable young people. We orchestrate context where they will learn to notice these patterns for themselves and make their own meaning, just like the woman did on the old man's sign, right? You've enabled the people passing by to understand his situation in a new way. But how you did that, nobody told you, this is how you should think about it, right? They just set it up so that you are more inclined to come to that yourself. And I think that's what we need to do more of in education. Let people engage with the information and build habits for questioning and deconstructing assumptions and building big understandings and understanding the why behind things and engaging with each other's perspectives and with historical perspectives in systematic ways. And these are the kinds of things that ironically also, and our data also second, deeply motivate people to think. These are the kinds of things that really put a fire under people to spend effort on thinking about. And we even show that in the neural data. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Mary Helen. And
welcome.
I think that, sorry, Professor Lydia, you would say something.
Sorry. I would say that it's important also to try to teach or make. It's interesting when children realize things by themselves, as you are saying, as not, okay, you have to think like this. This is the way it should be. Make them create this contextualized world and put themselves in somebody else's shoes.
Yes.
Also, what would be important here is accepting somebody else's ideas, which nowadays is very hard to do. Here
in Brazil, in the US, in a lot of places right now. That's right.
And so people don't change their minds, they think in a way, and then this should be worked on with children, the younger.
Absolutely. Develop habits for engaging with each other and asking why people think the things they do and trying to understand where their perspectives come from, but then also listening to other people's, right? So that you share yours too. Learn to effectively share yours in a way that isn't pushy, but instead is just owning it, but then also deconstructing it if you find, well, maybe this I never realized before, this perspective is actually harmful to some, and I hadn't thought about that, right? So these dispositions for humility, what we're calling intellectual virtues, in a project we have with a series of studies, is very much connected to this. And it's also connected to other disciplinary subjects, like how do you do your science? How do you do your transportation design? How do you understand voting in politics? Like all of these topics, every human topic, right? Every human institution is built by us. And so is part of this system of ways of thinking, which is also why we get such pervasive, long-term, historically held inequities and injustices built into the system that are so hard to dismantle, is because it just pervades everything we've built, right? These notions are deeply cultural and we've built them. How do we teach kids to examine them, to dispositionally examine the notions that they hold in order to engage with other people's beliefs, in order to construct something together that is beneficial and long-term oriented and sustainable and ethical? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Immordino-Yang and Professor Hübner. That's very inspirational.
Yeah.
For the purpose of time management, I'm going now, I guess my job is done for now. I'm going to pass the word back to Professor Tomic, my advisor. Thank you very much, Professor Immordino-Yang.
No, thank you. Good luck with your really interesting dissertation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much, Mary Helen, for, as Lilian said, the very inspiring talk. And it was, of course, not less, but more, a lot more than we expected, as usual, because your work and everything you do is really relevant. It has meaning in society. So thank you very much for your in sharing this with us. I had put a question here, but I can just maybe summarize. because now too, teaching reading in second language, I think all of us, most of us here, at some point, we taught reading in English, right? So I guess to say, and from your work, the type giving our students texts like, I always, because this is in fact for me to change. Susan is 7 years old. She gets up at, I don't know what time, she does this, she does that, blah, blah, blah. So, and then teachers tend to work with grammar, vocabulary, and meaning is just set aside. So I guess this is just what you say is just reinforcing the way I understand that teachers should try, even out to teachers, should try to build meaning in the classroom, right? And bring texts which are meaningful to the students. So I don't know if you agree with me.
Oh, of course. No, that sounds great. It's hard, right? But I completely agree. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So if we don't have any more questions, I guess, Lilia? No? All right. So thank you very much once again.
Thank you.
Helen, thank you. We thank the audience for having us, being here with us the whole year, once a month. Yeah, so thank you and see you next time.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.